How inmates are transferred to inside Unit 29, Mississippi State Penitentiary. Narrator, calm, measured. In the heart of the Mississippi Delta sits one of the most scrutinized prison complexes in the United States, Mississippi State Penitentiary, commonly known as Parchman. For more than a century, inmates have been transferred through its gates under procedures that are rarely seen, partially documented, and often misunderstood. Among those destinations inside Parchman is Unit 29. A housing unit whose intake process is governed not by rumor, but by policy, paperwork, and tightly controlled movement. What actually happens when an inmate is transferred into Unit 29? How are those transfers decided, processed, and carried out? And what do we truly know, and not know, about how inmates arrive there? This is Beyond the Bars. Before we begin, if you value deeply researched, fully factual prison documentaries, stories grounded in records, not rumors, take a moment to like and subscribe. Your support helps us continue sharing accurate, verified stories from behind prison walls. What this story is, and is not. This documentary is based only on what can be verified through Mississippi Department of Corrections policies, federal court filings, state investigations, credible reporting from Mississippi-based news organizations. Some details about internal housing decisions, including unit-level movement, are not publicly documented. When information is unavailable, disputed, or unclear, we will state that plainly. No speculation. No dramatization. No invented scenes. Only what can be proven. Where Unit 29 fits inside Parchman. Parchman is not a single prison, it is a complex of multiple housing units, each designated for different custody levels, populations, and operational needs. Units vary by security classification, physical structure, function within the institution. Unit 29 is one of several housing units on the grounds. Public records confirm its existence and use, but specific operational details about Unit 29's internal conditions are limited in publicly available documents. What is documented, however, is how inmates are transferred into units like it. And that process begins long before an inmate ever arrives at Parchman. The transfer decision. Inmates transferred into Parchman, and subsequently into Unit 29, do not arrive randomly. Transfers originate from several possible locations. County jails. Other Mississippi state prisons. In rare cases, federal custody returning to state jurisdiction. According to Mississippi Department of Corrections procedures, transfer decisions are influenced by factors including custody classification, disciplinary history, medical or mental health needs, bed availability, court orders. The specific reason an inmate is assigned to Unit 29 is not always disclosed publicly, and in many cases is unclear or redacted in records. What is clear is that unit placement follows internal MDOC classification decisions, not inmate preference. Authorization and movement. Before transport occurs, paperwork must be approved. This typically includes a formal transfer order, updated classification documentation, medical clearance. Only after authorization is complete does physical movement begin. Inmates are then transported under armed supervision, most often by MDOC-operated vehicles. Routes, timing, and security measures are not publicly disclosed for safety reasons. Arrival at Parchman. Upon arrival at Mississippi State Penitentiary, inmates are not immediately sent to a housing unit. Instead, they enter a controlled intake process. One that determines where they will sleep, work, and live inside the prison. This intake phase is critical. And it is here, after arrival but before housing, that the path toward Unit 29 becomes possible. Intake, where placement is decided. Once an inmate passes through the outer gates of Mississippi State Penitentiary, the transfer is far from complete. Arrival marks the beginning of intake. A tightly controlled, multi-step process that determines where an inmate will be housed, how they will be classified, and whether placement into a unit like Unit 29 is even possible. This stage is procedural, documented, and governed by Mississippi Department of Corrections policy. But it is also one of the least visible parts of incarceration. Initial receiving and identification. Upon arrival, inmates are formally logged into the Parchman system. This includes verification of identity, confirmation of sentence status, review of transport paperwork. Any discrepancies, missing court orders, conflicting sentences, or unresolved detainers, can delay housing decisions. In some cases, inmates remain in temporary holding areas until documentation is resolved. These delays are documented in MDOC records, though individual case details are often redacted from public release. Strip search and property inventory. As part of intake, inmates undergo a mandatory search and property inventory. This process is standard across Mississippi state prisons and is designed to prevent contraband entry, account for personal property, establish baseline security. Items not permitted in housing units are stored or confiscated per MDOC policy. There is no public evidence that Unit 29 receives different property rules than other general housing units, though internal enforcement may vary. Medical and mental health screening. One of the most consequential steps in intake is medical screening. MDOC policy requires initial health assessment, review of known medical conditions, mental health evaluation. These screenings determine whether an inmate can be safely housed in a general unit or requires specialized placement. Court records and federal investigations have shown that medical understaffing at Parchman has historically affected intake timelines, particularly during periods of overcrowding. However, medical clearance remains a required step before placement into any housing unit, including Unit 29. Classification, the deciding factor. Classification is where an inmate's path truly begins to narrow. According to MDOC administrative regulations, classification considers custody level, minimum, medium, close, or maximum. Behavioral history. Security risk. Sentence length. Prior institutional conduct. This process is conducted by classification staff, not correctional officers working housing units. The specific criteria used to assign an inmate to Unit 29 are not fully detailed in public documents. What is known is that inmates are placed into units that match their classification and institutional needs, not at random. How unit assignments are made. After classification, inmates are assigned to a unit based on available bed space, security requirements, operational considerations. Unit 29 is one of several units that may receive newly transferred inmates. Public reporting does not confirm that Unit 29 serves a single, exclusive population type. Claims that Unit 29 is reserved for specific groups are unconfirmed or speculative, and not supported by official MDOC documentation. What is confirmed? Once a unit assignment is made, it is logged into MDOC records and becomes part of the inmate's institutional history. Temporary holding before final move. Inmates are rarely moved directly from intake to their permanent housing unit. Instead, they may spend hours, or days, in temporary holding areas while logistics are finalized. Delays can occur due to staff availability, count procedures, security lockdowns. During this time, inmates are under constant supervision. Transfers into Unit 29 occur only when the unit is prepared to receive new inmates. The final clearance. Before movement to Unit 29 is authorized, final checks are completed. Confirmation of classification. Medical clearance. Unit availability. Only then is the order given. At that point, the intake process ends. And the movement process begins. The move to Unit 29. Once intake is complete, an inmate's transfer enters its final phase, physical movement. This is the moment most people imagine when they think of prison transfers, but in reality, it is governed by routine, restraint, and rigid protocol. At Mississippi State Penitentiary, movement between areas is one of the most tightly controlled operations on the grounds. And movement into Unit 29 is no exception. Preparing for escort. Before an inmate is moved from intake to a housing unit, standard security procedures are followed. These typically include hand restraints, escort by correctional officers, radio communication with control points. MDOC policy requires that inmate movement be logged and supervised to reduce the risk of escape, assault, or contraband transfer. There is no public documentation indicating that movement to Unit 29 involves different restraint procedures than movement to other housing units of similar classification. Controlled routes through the compound. Parchman's layout spans thousands of acres. Because of this, inmate movement follows predetermined routes, often involving secure walkways, vehicle transport for longer distances, controlled gate access. Which route is used depends on weather, staffing levels, security conditions. Exact routes are not publicly disclosed for safety reasons. What is confirmed through MDOC policy is that inmates are never moved independently, every step is supervised. Arrival at Unit 29. When an inmate arrives at Unit 29, the transfer is not yet complete. Arrival triggers a unit-level intake process, separate from the central intake already completed. This is where control shifts from intake staff to housing unit personnel. Unit-level check-in. Upon entry into Unit 29, staff verify inmate identity, unit assignment, bed assignment. This information must match central classification records. Any discrepancy, even a clerical error, can delay housing and result in the inmate being held temporarily in the unit's receiving area. These checks are documented in unit logs, though those logs are not public records. Search and orientation. Before being placed into a cell or dormitory space, inmates may undergo an additional search. A brief verbal orientation. Orientation typically covers unit rules, count times, movement restrictions. There is no publicly available evidence that Unit 29 orientation differs significantly from other housing units, though enforcement practices may vary. Bed assignment. Bed assignments are determined by unit staff based on availability and security considerations. Inmates do not choose their bed or housing location. Once assigned, that placement becomes the inmate's official residence within the prison, unless later changed by reclassification or administrative decision. At this point, the transfer is complete. What happens next? Life inside Unit 29 now begins. Daily routines, counts, meals, and movement are governed by unit schedules and institutional rules. Transfers out of Unit 29 can occur, but only through reclassification, disciplinary action, medical necessity, administrative decision. None of those processes are quick. And none are guaranteed. What we know, and don't know, about Unit 29. Public information about Unit 29 is limited. What is confirmed? It is an active housing unit at Parchman. Inmates are assigned through MDOC classification and intake procedures. Transfers follow documented security protocols. What remains unclear or not publicly documented? Internal living conditions specific to Unit 29. Whether Unit 29 serves a specialized population. Day-to-day operational differences compared to other units. Those gaps exist because much of prison life occurs beyond public view. Oversight, investigations, and what records reveal. By the time an inmate is transferred into Unit 29, the process appears complete. But in the public record, the story does not end there. Because Unit 29, like every housing unit at Mississippi State Penitentiary, Exists within a system that has been repeatedly examined, audited, and investigated. Those investigations don't always name Unit 29 specifically. But they do reveal how oversight works, and where it has failed. The role of oversight at Parchman. Oversight of Mississippi's prisons is divided among several entities. The Mississippi Department of Corrections. State lawmakers. Federal courts. The U.S. Department of Justice. Each plays a role in reviewing conditions, policies, and inmate treatment. However, oversight is often reactive, triggered by lawsuits, media reporting, or deaths in custody. Routine daily operations, including unit-level transfers, receive far less public scrutiny. Federal investigations and systemic findings. In 2020, the U.S. Department of Justice released findings related to conditions at Parchman following a civil rights investigation. Those findings documented chronic understaffing, inadequate supervision, failures in inmate safety, delays in medical and mental health care. The reports addressed system-wide conditions, not individual units. Unit 29 was not singled out in public DOJ documents. That absence does not indicate safety or danger, only that findings were made at the institutional level. Why unit-level details are rare. Housing units like Unit 29 rarely appear in public reports for one key reason. MDOC does not routinely publish unit-specific operational data. That includes incident rates by unit, staffing levels per unit, internal disciplinary trends. When unit-level information does surface, it is usually through litigation, whistleblower testimony, investigative journalism. Absent those triggers, daily operations remain undocumented to the public. Court cases and housing assignments. Court filings related to Parchman occasionally reference housing assignments. In these cases, inmates may allege unsafe placement, failure to protect, improper classification. However, housing units are often referenced generically, without detailed description. When Unit 29 appears in legal filings, details are frequently sealed, redacted, or limited to brief mentions. As a result, there is no comprehensive public legal record describing daily life inside Unit 29. Media reporting, what can be confirmed? Mississippi-based outlets, including statewide newspapers and national investigative organizations, have reported extensively on Parchman. Their reporting confirms transfers into housing units follow MDOC classification procedures. Overcrowding has periodically affected housing decisions. Staffing shortages have influenced supervision levels. However, journalists have also acknowledged limits to access. Media tours are controlled. Interviews are restricted. And unit interiors are rarely documented in depth. What remains unconfirmed or unclear? Despite years of reporting and investigation, several questions about Unit 29 remain unanswered in the public record. It is unclear whether Unit 29 serves a specialized inmate population, how its staffing levels compare to other units, whether its physical conditions differ meaningfully from neighboring units. Claims circulating online about Unit 29's purpose or conditions are often unverified. Without official documentation or sworn testimony, those claims cannot be confirmed. Why the transfer process still matters. Even without unit-specific transparency, the transfer process itself carries enormous weight. Classification decisions determine who lives where, who is housed together, who is exposed to risk. Once an inmate is transferred into Unit 29, changing that placement requires administrative action, often slow, and sometimes contested. For the inmate, that transfer is not a moment. It is a turning point. What the transfer reveals. The transfer of an inmate into Unit 29 is not dramatic on paper. There are no announcements. No explanations given to the public. No detailed records released afterward. It is a quiet administrative decision. Governed by classification scores, bed space, and internal policy, carried out inside Mississippi State Penitentiary with little visibility beyond its fences. Yet that decision determines where an inmate will live, who they will live beside, and what risks they may face. A system built on procedure and secrecy. From authorization to intake, from escort to unit placement, every step of the transfer process is documented internally, but rarely shared publicly. Oversight focuses on outcomes, deaths, lawsuits, federal findings. Daily decisions, like assignment to Unit 29, often remain invisible unless something goes wrong. This is not unique to Parchman. But at Parchman, history has shown how costly that invisibility can be. What we can say with certainty. What is confirmed? Transfers into Unit 29 follow MDOC classification and intake procedures. Inmates do not choose placement. Movement is controlled, supervised, and logged. Unit-level details are largely undocumented in public records. What remains unknown is not rumor, it is simply information that has never been released. And that absence matters. Inside America's prisons, where a person is placed can shape everything that follows. At Parchman, Unit 29 is not defined by myth, but by silence. And until transparency reaches beyond the gates, that silence will continue to define life on the inside. If you found this documentary valuable, consider liking and subscribing to Beyond the Bars. Your support allows us to keep telling factual, deeply researched stories from behind prison walls. Thanks for watching. And we'll see you in the next story, Beyond the Bars.